Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment webinar entitled Reversing the Plastics Crisis Through a Human Rights Approach. I'm your host, Nick Reardon, calling in from our offices, the offices of Alaska Community Action on Toxics based here in Anchorage, Alaska. My office and home here in Anchorage are on the traditional and unceded lands of the Dena'ina people. So I'd like to express my own and my co-workers' ongoing appreciation for the past and present stewards of this wonderful place. It's easy to appreciate on a beautiful spring day. For those of you new to this webinar series, the Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment is a regional partner of a larger national collaborative on health and the environment. And we often abbreviate it as CHE and pronounce it as CHE. So together, CHE and CHE Alaska and other CHE partners are working to advance knowledge and action related to links between human health and environmental factors like contaminants in air and water and food, and as well as an assortment of everyday products that you and I might buy at the store. So like today's topic focused on plastics that are everywhere in the world around us. So one place to learn more about these issues is at our respective websites. akaction.org is here in Anchorage, and then healthandenvironmental.org is the national CHE organization. So thanks to everyone joining us today or tuning in to the recording at a later date. The Zoom's Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen will allow you to direct questions to me, the moderator, as well as our guests, and the chat box is where you can share links or resources and dialogue amongst the whole group. And don't worry if you mix those up, we'll kind of sort it out as we go. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Alaska state legislators and their staff who could join us today. You're busy people, and we very much appreciate you taking the time to tune in for your concern about the interconnected issues of chemicals and plastics and human rights. Because these are global issues and they have impacts that reach across borders and oceans. So Alaska and the Arctic are just one example of a region where, especially here, despite our kind of perceived seclusion from industrial processes or waste management, we're certainly on the receiving end of contaminants carried by atmospheric and ocean currents, as well as simply in the very products that we import and buy and sell. So with the interconnected and global nature of these issues in mind, I'd like to introduce our guest. We're very grateful to be joined by Dr. Marcos Orellana, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, a position he's held since August 2020. Dr. Orellana is an expert in international environmental and human rights law, and his practice as legal advisor has included work with the United Nations agencies, governments, indigenous peoples, as well as many non-governmental organizations. He's also the lead researcher and author of the report that brings us together today, The Stages of the Plastic Cycle and Their Impacts on Human Rights. If you haven't already read this report, I recommend you take a look. It's succinct, it's just over 20 pages, and it's pretty compelling. And I'm so grateful to have Dr. Orellana here to join us today, and yeah, for all of you who made time to tune in. So welcome again. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to the Alaska Collaborative on Health and Environment, CHE, for this opportunity to have a conversation about a topic that is growing in significance as we speak. Plastics has become clearly a global threat to a livable planet, to the enjoyment of human rights, and to future generations. I would like to start out by pointing out that I have received a mandate from the United Nations Human Rights Council to monitor and report on issues of sound management of chemicals and wastes as they relate to human rights. In its most recent resolution that renews my mandate, the Human Rights Council has put an emphasis on information concerning developments, gaps, and shortcomings in international instruments. So I began scanning the horizon to identify where where are those gaps and shortcomings, and where are those developments? And I very quickly came across the issue of plastics, the global tide of plastics. And that was then the inspiration of the report that Nick mentioned, which I presented to the General Assembly last year. These reports are so-called thematic reports. They're one of the tools that special procedures of the Human Rights Council, like myself as UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, these are the tools that, or some of them, that we deploy in carrying out our mandate. In that report to the General Assembly, there are a number of conclusions and recommendations, and one of them is a call for a new treaty on plastics. So I was quite pleased to see that the UN Environment Assembly that took place the last week of February in Nairobi, Kenya, its session 5.2, decided to kick off negotiations towards a new treaty on plastics pollution. And in that direction, it set up an intergovernmental negotiating committee. So a couple of things that are relevant from that resolution, I'll come back to this later on, but at this time, the resolution is significant, not only because it puts in motion the process towards a new instrument, establishing 2 years in order to conclude it, but it addresses plastics pollution in its life cycle. That is not, it could have taken a more artificial approach, as it were, to identify or focus on a specific part of the problem, but it's addressing the life cycle, because that is the way to get at the whole plastics problem without any gaps. Next steps on that include an ad hoc open-ended working group to set up timetable, work plan, to begin to discuss scope. So I'll come back to some of those elements of the UNEA resolution. Now, going into the UN Environmental Assembly, UNEA, there was a lot of discussion in the months prior about the problem. And I want to highlight a couple of things there. The plastics crisis is global in magnitude. If we look back in time, we can see that large-scale manufacturing of plastics began in the 1950s at the rate of about 2 million tons a year. Today, the annual production is about 415 million tons. And it is projected to quadruple by 2050. Now, these figures are staggering, and that's why scientists and others have voiced concern that by that time, by 2050, there will be more plastics than fish in the oceans, unless we can reverse the toxic tide of plastics. Another element that I think is relevant by way of background is to point out that a few companies produce most polymers. So in that sense, the problem is similar to that which existed at the time of the negotiation of the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, which, unlike climate change, which is diffuse around the world, the problem is concentrated. There are a few companies, but at the same time, the supply chains and the consumption involves most, if not all, countries in the world. So we have a global problem that requires coordination, that has transboundary dimensions, that has global environmental justice dimensions, but which can be tackled effectively because the main producers are concentrated. Now, this crisis, the plastics crisis, is not unlike others that the international community has addressed. It can be tackled, but for that, all its key dimensions need to be addressed. We won't succeed if we just look at trade or biodiversity or technology. All of that must be dealt with, and that's where the life cycle approach that's included in the resolution adopted by UNEA that kicks off the process and negotiations toward the treaty is so significant. Now, that's also where human rights come in the picture. Human rights are implicated in every stage of the cycle of plastics. If we look at extraction of the fossil fuels that are used as the virgin material for the production of plastics, there's ample evidence how these extractive industries, oil and gas, coal at times, have had adverse impacts on the enjoyment of local communities, of indigenous peoples that are harmed by these operations. When it comes to extraction, you can also think about transport. I recently submitted an amicus curiae brief, so that's a written brief to the Constitutional Court of Ecuador in a case involving an oil spill out of a pipeline that contaminated numerous indigenous communities along the Napo and Coca rivers in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So we see that extraction also implies the risks and harms associated to the transport of these fossil fuels that are used for the production of plastics. Another stage that has significant impacts on human rights is no doubt manufacturing. It's often fence line communities in the vicinity of the plants, the facilities that produce plastics, that bear the disproportionate impact on the pollution that's generated by the manufacturing of plastics. Recently, I have sent allegation letters. So these are another tool that mandates that special procedures of the Human Rights Council have to carry out their work. Send these allegation letters to the United States because of the expansion of the petrochemical industry in St. James Parish in Louisiana, what's also known as Cancer Alley. There, the statistics, the data is also appalling in terms of the disproportionate impact that people of African descent suffer as a result of the air pollution and other contamination resulting from the petrochemical industries. This project Sunshine by the company Formosa is a direct example and threat to the further enjoyment of human rights, the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, for example. If we look at another stage of the plastic cycle, you may recall a couple months ago the situation of the Express Pearl, this vessel off the coasts of Sri Lanka that was carrying plastics nurdles, so these small pieces of plastics from which further elaboration of plastics are manufactured. Well, this ship sank, it caught fire. Hundreds of tons ended up in the beaches of Sri Lanka, imposing a heavy cost on the people that rely on the sea for their livelihoods and subsistence, as well as for development, for the tourism or food, and etc. Yet another stage in the plastic cycle is the use of plastics products. And here we see that plastics are not just inert substances. They contain toxic additives in order to give them properties that make them attractive. By some estimates, there are more than 10,000 chemicals that are added to plastics in order for them to be more transparent or less transparent, or more flexible or less flexible, or more resistant to ultraviolet radiation or less resistant, and so forth. Now, these chemicals, these toxic additives, they leach, they migrate from the plastics, and they begin to contaminate the environment and our bodies as humans. You may have seen last week a report about microplastics being found in human blood. This latest scientific finding, previously we we learned about microplastics being found in the human placenta. Now, this is not the place where microplastics are intended or supposed to be. And the impacts and implications of this are largely yet unknown. But that's where the precautionary principle comes in, of prevention, precaution, taking action in order to avoid harm despite scientific uncertainties regarding the extent of that harm. In addition to the staggering number, the figure 10,000 chemicals added to plastics, I think it's important to recall that many of these additives, they are toxic, they are hazardous, they are either persistent organic pollutants. So if we look at the agenda of the upcoming Conference of the Parties of the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, there's one amendment that looks at a specific chemical that is added to plastics in order to deal with ultraviolet radiation. For example, so POPs, we know that POPs are among the most hazardous pollutants known to humans. And so this is not an insignificant problem. Similarly, many of these pollutants are disruptors of the endocrine system. And so the impacts on children, for example, are particularly acute because these endocrine disrupting chemicals upset their hormones and their development process, and they make of children adults more quickly than would otherwise be the case. So in other words, these chemicals, these hazardous EDCs for the acronym, they rob children of their childhood. Now, these are examples of the human rights issues implicated at every stage of the cycle of plastics. Now, I think it's also relevant to point out that these impacts fall disproportionately on groups that may find themselves in vulnerable situations at certain given times. I relate the example of indigenous peoples who have suffered for decades out of the extraction of fossil fuels from their lands and territories that have contaminated their waters, that have contaminated their lands with heavy metals, that have suffered oil spills. But we can also talk about workers in plastic facilities that are exposed to pollution, workers that were on the other side of the life cycle of plastic, waste pickers that are also exposed to plastics and their toxic impacts. I've also talked about children and endocrine disrupting chemicals. We can also identify women in certain stages of their life, especially certainly in adolescence, lactation, women that are pregnant or women that are experiencing menopause. Women in these stages of their life are particularly sensitive to certain chemicals found in plastics. And of course, future generations that are not here to speak for their rights, but for which we today, our present generation, has a responsibility to address and not impair the effective enjoyment of their rights. If we look at the horizon that exists in international legal instruments that concern in one way or another the problem of plastics, we see fragmentation. We see fragmentation either because of subject matter. Some instruments concern only with wastes, other with, such as the Basel Convention, I'll come back to that in a moment, or the Stockholm Convention concerns itself only with a small class of chemicals and it goes addressing them one by one. So this is a limitation, the subject matter, and it leads to fragmentation. Also, the regional scope. Some instruments are not global in character, but they are only regional, and so they don't capture the whole of the problem. Examples of this are the instruments in the regional seas program of the UN Environment Program. If we look at a couple of specific examples, the Basel Convention on transboundary movements of hazardous wastes, we can see that in 2019, This instrument, the Conference of the Parties, adopted amendments to that instrument to close what was clearly a sham recycling loophole. So as in the guise of recycling, plastics was being transferred often from north to south and ended up often being dumped in poor communities and then burned, exposing those communities to the toxic fumes that are released by plastics. If we look at MARPOL, so these are the instruments that are covered under the International Maritime Organization. MARPOL 73-78 is the prime instrument that concerns the protection of the environment in relation to navigation. There are others, but this is in connection with operational pollution from vessels. This instrument prohibits the dumping of or the discharge of plastic wastes into the ocean. Instead, it requires contracting parties to establish port reception facilities. So when the vessel comes to port, the plastics are unloaded or offloaded to this reception facility. Now, that sounds like an incentive for vessels not to dump or to discharge plastics wastes. Unfortunately, many of these reception facilities are inadequate. And so when the plastics reach the port, they enter the inadequate or the mismanagement of plastics in that country and often find themselves very quickly back in rivers or back in the ocean because they're not managed correctly. So there are questions as to how to strengthen MARPOL so as to strengthen the ability of port reception states to deal with the problem. Now, all of this fragmentation leads to the need for a new global legally binding agreement on plastics that is comprehensive, that addresses all stages in the cycle. In those negotiations that are going to begin in a couple of months, and as I mentioned, are expected to conclude by the end of 2024, there are certain human rights principles that can help transition towards a chemically safe circular economy, because that's the idea, for an instrument to be able to invite, incentivize, even force the transition from a linear production and consumption pattern of plastics is created, used, and then disposed, to a circular economy where materials can be used longer in the economy, where at the end of the day, there is no hazardous or other waste created by plastics. Now, a key element of that is unavoidably the reduction in plastics production. Plastics is not essential for human life. Plastics is not essential for human societies. Human civilization, for most of its history, has developed without plastics. Now, today, plastics are imposing a global threat to human health and the environment, and we need to, as international community, find a way to break and reverse the toxic tide of plastics. These human rights principles can help move in that direction. Let me give a couple examples. Information is one, is certainly the starting point. Information such as on the registration of polymers, such as on which additives are added to polymers. All of this is helpful, for example, in controlling, in securing effective remedies, etc. Despite the importance of information and its recognition as a human right to information, we see that disinformation has become a lucrative business. There are firms that specialize in obfuscating, in spreading false information to confuse society. And an example of this is plastics recycling. This is an example of what could be considered a direct assault on the right to science, so the right to benefit from scientific progress, on the right to information. Let's recall where that narrative of recycling comes from. It doesn't come, this was unearthed or revealed, uncovered by investigative journalists from National Public Radio in the United States. This message did not come from environmental groups. It did not come from human rights groups. It came from the plastics industry because it gives the false safe security to the consumer that it is behaving in an environmentally responsible way. But the capacity to recycle is not there. And in fact, less than 10% of plastics are recycled. And when they are recycled, the toxic additives in plastics are concentrated. So recycling at this time with current rates and technologies is more of an illusion to distract. It's more of a mirage that creates an illusion of change, but does not really address the problem. This is a diversion tactic. It's a delay tactic. It also tries to put emphasis on individual responsibility instead of the public regulation that's needed at the global level to address a global threat. In addition to information as a key principle, I would like to point out to participation, public participation as another, in the elaboration of plastics policy, for example. Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development resulted from the Earth Summit now almost 30 years ago, already articulated and identified that environmental issues are best handled with the participation of the concerned public at the relevant stages. That principle 10 also articulated the right to access environmental justice, so citizen access to justice. Now, what does that look like in regards to the treaty design, so the road ahead? I'll come back to that question in a minute. If thinking about principles, human rights principles that are relevant for a chemically safe circular economy, I would like to point out just transition. Just transition is acquiring greater force in across the board in international environmental law. Perhaps it found its origins in climate change and the need for governmental policies that move into the decarbonization of the economies to also address the position, the situation of workers that would be left without a job. So the transition can be fair and that no one is left behind. That construct and thinking of putting an emphasis on groups and persons in vulnerable situations is also relevant for plastics. There are people that make a living out of plastics in various stages of the cycle, where that's also where just transition becomes relevant. And just as relevant, another principle or other principles that are relevant are environmental principles that have found a way into the human rights framework. I'm referring to the principles of prevention, principle of precaution, the polluter pays principle. These principles were elaborated to address environmental issues. So they are, in a way, environmental principles in their inception or origins, but through practice and the construction of jurisprudence in international human rights forums, they have been incorporated into the human rights realm, and they are relevant to addressing plastics. For example, when it comes to prevention and precaution, the assessment of the potential impacts of solutions. I referred already to the risks of recycling as a narrative, but there are others. Bioplastics is one of them, because bioplastics made out of plants also contain toxic additives that eventually migrate and harm biodiversity, and human health. There's also much talk about plastics to fuel and incineration. Now, these carry their problems as well. Incineration, as we know, of plastics create dioxins. Dioxins are perhaps some of the most hazardous substances out there in the planet. And so the concern is significant as in terms of the air pollution, also the generation of toxic ash. So the efficiency of incinerators and the compatibility with a non-toxic environment, the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment has been put into question. So in looking at the assessment of alternatives, an important element of that is product design in order to enable the circularity of solutions. If we look at finally on these issues of human rights principles at the polluter pays principle, one implementation, one specific of this principle is in extended producer responsibility frameworks. Now, this was originally intended to help governments cover the costs of waste management facilities by putting a price in the product themselves. Now, when it comes to plastics, we see that extended producer responsibility also has a transboundary dimension. So the trade in plastic means that EPR, for the acronym, extends across borders, because it's often the case that short-lived plastics products that go from north to south very quickly become waste and transfer the environmental burden onto developing countries and marginalized communities in those countries. So what's coming up in the road ahead? I mentioned at the beginning that the UNIA resolution sets up calls for an ad hoc open-ended working group. Now, this working group is expected to meet in May, and after that, what is expected of that meeting is a specific timetable and work plan and discussions on scope of the instrument, again with a view to concluding negotiations by the end of 2024. So this is the time to start thinking about treaty design. What are the building blocks, the elements that should inform and should form part of that treaty? There's a lot that could be said there. The UNIA resolution, if you haven't shared it, Nick, perhaps we can put it on the chat. There's a lot there, but I wish to make comments on 3 points. One is on national action plans. In the road towards this UNIA resolution, there was a lot of debate and very heated negotiations as to what that instrument, the new plastics treaty, should look like. And there were competing visions and resolutions on the table. Some of them did not want a legally binding instrument at all, but instead nationally focused action. Now, national action plans are likely to be the cornerstone of a new treaty on plastics. That's how the negotiations at UNIA came out. And this is signaling a trend that we're seeing in international environmental instruments. We see it in the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, for example. We see it in the Minamata Convention on Mercury when it comes to small-scale mining. We also see it by analogy, not same terminology, but by analogy in the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. So the idea that the international treaty is a vessel, as it were, it's a vessel, and within it, each country will appreciate and define its national circumstances and its contributions to addressing a global problem, and will elaborate a national action plan. Now, there's a lot to be said about this model. Some have pointed out that it diminishes the symbolic force and actual force of the rule of law, because at the end of the day, international law ceases to be binding, and instead it enables countries to prepare whichever national action plans they wish without any other form of accountability. Others have pointed out, on the other hand, that national action plans are important because they allow for the flexibility needed for each country to address its own circumstances, since a cookie cutter approach of one size fits all is not useful. So the debate lives on. There's a lot that can be discussed there. See, we're running out of time, but I do want to make a couple other points on, first on remedies by way of treaty design. Again, if we look in parallel to how the climate change regime has unfolded, the questions of loss and damage are increasingly controversial and also increasingly relevant. Now, here is an opportunity to address similar issues from the outset, not after the fact, not 10 years later, but at the outset. Who is going to clean up the gyres, the islands of plastics that are floating in the oceans? Who's going to do that? Now, it may be that negotiators find that that is too big of a question to ask, but this is a question that concerns remedies. Who is going to provide a remedy to coastal communities that are impacted by the flood of plastics on the beaches, for example? So I would point to remedies as a second element of treaty design, in addition to national action plans. And the third and last one I wish to address is compliance. Compliance, MEAs recently have established compliance committees, non-punitive, non-adversarial. But often these committees, they do not allow for individuals to present communications. They are state-to-state mechanisms, and that limits their ability to focus attention and to address urgent issues because of the politics involved. So questions on compliance are also likely to be very heated and controversial. So, cognizance of time, in conclusion, we are facing a global plastics crisis. There's no doubt. The science is compelling, and to deal with it, we need action at all levels. We need to address human rights impacts of plastics in each of the stages, and in the treaty design, adopting a rights-based approach, a human rights-based approach centered on the human rights principles that I discussed, focusing on transparency, participation, and accountability is critical, so that the solutions can be effective, they can solve the problem, and they can be legitimate. They don't fall on other people's backs. Thank you for your attention, and I am very attentive to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orellana. It's really a deep understanding of this subject matter. I appreciate you sharing that with us. There have been, some questions popping in. I invite folks to continue to add their questions. Feel free to have a look at them yourself, but I'll as the moderator, I'll see here. Marina Fernandez is asking, are there incentives for people who reuse plastics and apply circular economies? Or what are we doing about educating in circular economies? Some people don't even know how to separate their residues.
Shall we go ahead one by one?
Yeah.
So this is part of the discussions that need to take place in the context of the treaty negotiations. One approach here is that the systems for sorting out, for disaggregating, and for recycling, including the extended producer responsibility frameworks, the costs of those are huge. And who's going to pay the bill? Especially in developing countries that are already strapped for cash. So this is a big question. That's where the discussions at UNEA also talked about, touched upon financing. If we look at how financing has evolved to deal with global environmental issues, we see that that the Montreal Protocol, the Montreal setting up an international fund, has been very successful and has had a significant amount of monies available to it to help countries transition and phase out ozone depleting substances. The Green Climate Fund to deal with climate change mitigation, largely also some elements of adaptation, is also significant in its volume, but perhaps not so much in terms of the amount that's needed to address the immensity of the challenge of decarbonization. And so there's still much room to improve there. If we look at, by contrast, in the chemicals and waste cluster, Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, so the needs that have been identified exceed exponentially the amounts of monies that have been allocated through the Global Environmental Facility in order to help countries meet those costs. And so there's a big question as to whether countries, and especially industrialized countries, will be able to put and will be willing to put on the table the amount of resources that is necessary in order for the establishment of the recycling and sorting programs that need to be established.
Thanks for that, Dr. Orellana. We've had several questions come in about enforcement as well. What are the mechanisms to hold the chemicals and plastics industry accountable? And as well as questions about, where is it here? The enforcement, are there penalties, for example, in the Basel Convention for this illegal transboundary movements of plastics? Could you speak to that?
Certainly. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the treaty design on plastics pollution is going to be taken up by the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. And so at this time, we have possibilities and ideas. We don't have yet the tools that would be enabled by the treaty. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second one is that action is not only at the global level through the treaty on plastics pollution, but at every level. And in this regard, treaties are only as strong as their ability to be implemented through national laws and legislation, also regional measures. So it will come down to what is the relation between the treaty and the regulations at the national level that will give it force. Will those regulations be strong, robust, enforceable, or will we end up with a regime like that of the Paris Agreement that each country decides how much to contribute, but then there is no real mechanism to hold the country accountable to meeting those targets? Now, that is where rights-based litigation has become so important in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, and even before that. In my previous professional experience, I had the opportunity to act on behalf of Inuit Circumpolar Conference, Inuit communities in the Arctic, that presented a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in regards to the US's failure to deal with climate change effectively, and how that failure was violating the rights to culture, to life, to health, to a healthy environment, as protected in the American Declaration of the Rights of Man and the American Convention on Human Rights. Now, I mentioned that because this interface between climate change and human rights brought to the table the ability to initiate rights-based litigation, which in this context can also be seen as quite relevant in order to compel countries to meet their objectives as articulated in their national action plans or their nationally determined contributions or otherwise determined at the national level. So while the instruments themselves may be weak and may not offer the enforcement tools that are needed to make their promises a reality, rights-based litigation could provide the needed enforcement mechanism. But of course, rights-based litigation also has its limits, and maybe that's a topic for another webinar. The third part of the question was on the Basel Convention. The Basel Convention, negotiated adopted in 1989, makes the illegal transboundary movement of hazardous wastes a crime. And under its provisions, it establishes the obligations of state parties to criminalize this activity. And so we see that there's the treaty again, which compels the party to change or modify or establish in its internal laws a new crime, the crime of transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. Now, despite this, one of the tools of the mandates are to conduct country visits, 2 a year. I had the chance to visit Italy last December and documented the export of more than 200 containers of wastes from Italy to Tunisia, where some of them were burned and began to rot and causing a huge nuisance. So despite these provisions, problems still occur. This is not an isolated case, unfortunately. There are many instances of ongoing transboundary illegal environmental crime.
Thank you, Dr. Orellana, for that response. There's a couple questions also coming up about barriers to making improvements or change. So what is the biggest barrier found to decrease production of plastics? As well as another individual is asking a barrier to why engineers or scientists aren't studying the impacts of new technologies or even the additives to plastics.
Well, I would point out two barriers which are to some extent clearly visible. One, I refer to disinformation. So the delay tactics, the diversion tactics, the individual responsibility frame tactics, all of this is not accidental. It is deliberate to maintain a status quo that benefits plastic producers, that benefits the petrochemical industry, that benefits fossil fuel extraction, and the economic interest, the financial interest in all of those segments of the sector, they are significant, and so that's certainly a big obstacle. The ability of these industries to buy off politicians, legislators, administrators, and so forth. That is, I think, perhaps the biggest obstacle or challenge that the treaty and the concerted action on plastics is facing worldwide.
Thank you. There's a couple questions here. What is the role of NGOs and civil society in the negotiation of the new treaty on plastics? And so how best can we contribute? And there's also comments about that a just sustainable transition, as you were describing, isn't being talked about beyond the groups of activists as we are labeled.
Right. So on the first question, the rules of procedure that govern the treaty negotiations are likely to be those of the forum that set it up, and so that's the UN Environment Assembly. and that means that there is space for observers to engage the process. If we look back at the dynamics of the negotiations of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, so this is the youngest instrument in the family of multilateral environmental agreements. In those negotiations, there were groups and networks of NGOs that participated in those negotiations heavily, bringing in ideas and proposals and so forth. And so there are opportunities to weigh in for civil society. Now, it is an intergovernmental process. So in that sense, it is states making the final determinations and making decisions. But since negotiations are conducted by consensus, so meaning that all states participating need to agree in order for an instrument to be adopted, and there's more that could be said about consensus, but to perhaps oversimplify the point, the ideas that are coming into the discussion, it doesn't matter their provenance. It is often the case that states take them up, and even when they don't, the ideas acquire a force of themselves because of the rule for consensus and how the negotiations are conducted. So we can expect that there should be, and there will be, I would anticipate, the opportunities for civil society engagement in the process.
Thank you. There's a couple questions. Let's see. There's an anonymous person. If decision makers for geographic states sign national agreements, one second here, sorry. But what do you think of the idea of setting production limits, reduction targets for plastics in the treaty? Is it possible, and could it be enforced?
So there's two questions there. No, on the previous one that you started talking about, this is perhaps a bit of a technical question, but the Basel Convention contains provisions that are intended to allow for parties to conclude agreements between themselves in regards to the transfer of hazardous wastes. And the idea behind here is that these agreements can capture economies of scale that would otherwise not be available. Now, that said, the Basel Convention also adopted the so-called Basel Ban amendments that prohibit the transfer of hazardous wastes from countries from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, to non-OECD countries. Now, it's also possible that there could be an agreement between a party and a non-party to the Basel Convention for the purposes of the transfer of hazardous waste. In such an instance, that agreement should be equivalent in its protections to the Basel Convention. Now, this is what has prompted the whole debate about shipbreaking and the transfer of end-of-life vessels from, for example, Europe to the beaches in India and Bangladesh. Is the Hong Kong Convention of the IMO on ship recycling functionally equivalent to the protections established in the Basel Convention? This is a big question. And so the answer to the question, unfortunately, is not an easy question, but there are ways to approach it. I hope that wasn't too technical of an answer, but the bigger picture question is the second one you were asking, Nick, and I see that Karen Wersick is putting on the Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, my sense is that given the trajectories and given the capacities, the limitations on production limits on reduction of plastics is inevitable. It's indispensable. We as the international community cannot continue in the same path that we have been over the last couple of years or decades. We need to reduce the level of plastics production. Now, how is this possible? Could it be enforced? That's precisely the big challenge and task that the INC is facing in its coming design of a treaty. Now, some are thinking and talking about having an objective. So in a way, Paris Agreement applied to plastics, or the model of the Paris Agreement applied to plastic, having a global objective, such as the global objective on mitigation, so reduction to 1.5 Celsius. In this instance, reduction of the volume of plastics production to a certain quantity. Now, what that quantity will be, well, that's where the devil is in the details. Now, that's where the negotiations also begin. Now, how could it then be enforced? That's where national action plans then come into play. Now, this goes back to the question that I posed earlier. Will national action plans be voluntary for countries, or will there be some accountability mechanism for the measures needed to make those national action plans achieve the targets that they are articulating?
Thank you, Dr. Orellana. So another question here: if industries pollute and buy off workers with good paying union jobs in industries that prove over the long run to be medically harmful to workers, so for example, in the plastics industry, but yeah, how can we discuss this multidimensional ethical issue or issues around these negotiations?
So my predecessor in the mandate on toxics and human rights produced a set of principles on workers' rights. And this is an approach consonant with a rights-based approach that looks at persons that may find themselves in vulnerable situations. He also produced reports and analysis on, for example, on toxics and children. I think that approach is sound and compelling, and for that reason, this year I am producing a report on the impacts of toxics on indigenous peoples. To give an example of groups, peoples that may find themselves in vulnerable situations at certain points in their lives. So with that preface, in those principles, you'll see that there's the right for workers not to be exposed to hazardous substances. Now, that by way of principle, by way of debate, at times I have faced the argument when it comes to mercury, for example, and the contamination in the Amazon or in rainforest and elsewhere of small-scale mining, that miners have rights too, as if implying that miners have a right to carry out small-scale mining despite the pollution that causes. And I think there's a fallacy there that needs to be clearly called out, because it's certainly the case that workers and miners and others have rights as well, including the right to a living wage and to adequate conditions of life. But that does not mean that one has the right to engage in an occupation that harms others. If there were an association of fishers that were to go out and hunt blue whales, that is not a protected activity under national, under international, under human rights law. Similarly, if there's it's an industry with good paying jobs, however, it pollutes the environment, those who are suffering the pollution have a right to live in a non-toxic environment. And that takes precedence over any potential economic benefits that may accrue to a corporation or to a set of individual workers in that corporation.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking at we're reaching the top of the hour. There's one last question here that's asking if you'd comment on the development of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, it's an initiative. No, it's an idea that is gaining force, and my sense is that as humanity gains further awareness of the environmental and climate emergency that we are facing, there will be initiatives like this in order to keep fossil fuels on the ground. The International Energy Agency has already come out with reports that point to the need for fossil fuels to stay on the ground. No new exploration of fossil fuels if we are to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. Now, let's recall the Paris Agreement sets out what are considered, in a way, the rails, the safety rails, but already at 1.5 increase in temperature, not to mention 2 Celsius, we will see if we get there, and everything seems to be indicating that we are moving in that trajectory, and very quickly, catastrophic impacts that will compromise the effective enjoyment of human rights for many, many people, and many peoples as well. Small island developing states are going to be submerged under those scenarios, and this puts into question the diversity of the human family, principles like self-determination, and other fundamental principles of international human rights law and policy. So when it comes to fossil fuels, the imperative is towards decarbonization. How fast can we get there? That's perhaps what the Paris Agreement is trying to do, to get there fast enough, but so far it has not been sufficiently ambitious. What's clear is that in the transition towards a new energy matrix, fossil fuels have no place. There's no place for combustion of fossil fuels. The bandwidth, or as it were, of the atmosphere is already saturated, and as humanity, we cannot afford to continue to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orellana, for those excellent answers in the presentation, and for sticking with us here an extra couple of minutes. I really appreciate it. All of us here at ACAT and Che, Alaska, really appreciate your time. And to everyone, thank you for joining us for this hour. There'll be a recording, and I'll send out an email with links to a few additional resources that came up during our conversation, as well as a way to access the recording in an email tomorrow. Our next Che Alaska webinar is on Thursday, April 14th, when we'll be joined by Dr. Carol Kwiatkowski from the Green Science Policy Institute for a presentation on PFAS and class-based regulations. So thanks so much to the rest of ACAT and the Che team in the background for helping make this webinar series run smoothly. And please send along any additional questions or comments. You can reach out to my email, nick.r@akaction.org, or 907-222-7714. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Orellana, and everyone else for joining us, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your week. Bye for now.
Thank you very much. All the best. Cheers.